Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chip Gibbons. I'm the Policy Director of Defending Rights and Dissent. Defending Rights and Dissent is a national civil liberties organization that defends your right to know and freedom to act through grassroots mobilization, public education, policy expertise, and advocacy journalism. In that grand tradition today, we have invited to join us Marjorie Cohn, Professor Emerita at the Thomas Jefferson School of Law, and a former president of the National Lawyers Guild. Marjorie is the author of many, many books and articles, including two that are very relevant today. She co-authored Rules of Disengagement, The Politics of and Honor of Military Dissent, along with her co-author Kathleen Gilbert. And Marjorie is the editor of Drones and Targeted Killing, Legal, Moral, and Geopolitical Issues. Today, we're to discuss the retaliation against 6 Democratic senators for reminding members of the military that they have a right to refuse illegal orders, as well as discuss the legality of Pete Hegseth's and the Trump administration's strikes in the Caribbean. This is an extremely pressing and timely issue. Just last night, the Trump administration seized in international waters, I believe, or either Venezuelan territorial waters, an oil tanker, further escalating tensions with Venezuela and further putting us on the path to war with a country that Congress has not authorized military force against. We also learned just before we went live that the Navy, this is CNN, Navy delivers report to Hegseth on potential punishment for Senator Mark Kelly over illegal orders video. So this is very well scheduled with that news. So I'm going to get right to it with Marjorie. Marjorie, so the background here is that there was a 90-second video featuring 6 Democrats, all either military veterans or with intelligence backgrounds. And in the video, they said, addressing U.S. soldiers, like us, you all swore an oath to protect and defend this Constitution. Right now, the threats to our Constitution aren't just coming from abroad, but right here at home. Our laws are clear. You can refuse illegal orders. You can refuse illegal orders. You must refuse illegal orders. No one has to carry out orders that violate the laws or our Constitution. In a second, I want to get into Trump and the FBI and Hegseth's reaction to this video and some of the claims they made. But before we go there, I just want to ask you, as a statement of law, you can refuse illegal orders. You must refuse illegal orders. No one has to carry out orders that violate the law or our Constitution. Is this a factual statement?
It is, Chip, and it's not just you can or you may refuse illegal orders. You have a duty to refuse illegal orders. That's very, very clear. The Uniform Code of Military Justice says that a service member can be punished by court-martial for refusing to obey a lawful order. Now, although the Uniform Code does not define lawful, the Manual for Courts-Martial, which has the weight of law, states that an order is lawful unless it is contrary to the Constitution, the laws of the United States, or lawful superior orders, or for some other reason is beyond the authority of the official issuing it. That manual also said that although it may be inferred that an order to perform a military duty or act is lawful, this inference does not apply to a patently illegal order, such as one that directs the commission of a crime. The rules for court-martial, which also has the weight of law, says that acting pursuant to orders is a legitimate defense unless the accused knew the orders to be lawful or a person of ordinary sense and understanding would have known the orders to be lawful. And finally, it says the lawfulness of an order is a question of law to be determined by the military judge. Now, normally that determination is made only after a service member refuses to obey an order. And it is that determination is made in a trial, in a court-martial or a war crimes tribunal. So a service member, although service members have a duty to disobey unlawful orders, there is a risk that disobeying an order might have negative ramifications down the line if the judges do not ultimately agree with you.
One of the reasons we brought you on today, you have a very wide range of legal knowledge, and we always love having you on as an expert on these programs. But you're uniquely qualified to weigh in here because you've been called to testify at court-martials as an expert witness on service members' duty to disobey unlawful orders. Could you, before I return to Donald Trump, I know we're all eager to get back to Mr. Trump, could you comment on those experiences? Is it an uphill battle to raise that defense? How often does it work? What did you witness when you were a witness in these cases?
Well, first of all, Chip, in 2006, U.S. Army First Lieutenant Aaron Watada became the first commissioned officer to publicly disobey an order to deploy to Iraq. And he said, to stop an illegal and unjust war, the soldiers can choose to stop fighting it. The Army charged Watada with missing movement and conduct unbecoming an officer and a gentleman. And Watada said, "It is my obligation and my duty to refuse any orders to participate in this war. An order to take part in an illegal war is unlawful in itself. So my obligation is not to follow an order to go to Iraq." At Watada's court-martial, I was called by the defense as an expert witness, but the military judge refused to allow me to testify as an expert on the illegality of the Iraq war and the war crimes that the Bush administration was committing there. Eventually, the judge declared a mistrial, and although the government had sought a second court-martial in which Watada would have faced 6 years in custody and a dishonorable discharge, the judge said that double jeopardy had attached. So Watada was allowed to resign from the Army and was discharged under less than honorable conditions. Now, in the case of Pablo Paredes, who was court-martialed in 2005, he was U.S. Navy Petty Officer Third Class. He refused to board an amphibious assault ship that would have transported 3,000 Marines to Iraq. He refused because he thought he would be complicit as a war criminal. I was allowed to testify at his court-martial. The Navy charged him with unauthorized absence and missing his ship's movement by design. The military judge convicted him of missing movement by design, but dismissed the unauthorized absence charge. Before the sentencing, Paredes told the judge, "I am guilty of believing this war is illegal. I am guilty of believing that as a service member, I have a duty to refuse to participate in this war because it is illegal. I believe as a member of the armed forces, beyond having a duty to my chain of command and my president, I have a higher duty to my conscience and to participate in any way, hands-on or indirect, in the current aggression that has been unleashed on Iraq." Now, the judge did not allow me to testify in the guilt phase, but he did allow me, the Navy judge did allow me to testify at the sentencing hearing. And I testified that the Iraq war was illegal because it violated the UN Charter, and that Paredes had a reasonable belief that by transporting the Marines to Iraq, he would place them in the position of committing war crimes. And I explained how U.S. forces were torturing prisoners at Abu Ghraib prison, and that constituted a war crime. Then I said that both the Nuremberg Principles and the Uniform Code of Military Justice established a duty to obey lawful orders, but a duty to disobey unlawful orders. And then I concluded that orders to board that ship and transport Marines to fight in an illegal war and potentially commit war crimes were unlawful. And that Paredes therefore had a duty to refuse those unlawful orders to embark on the ship in 2004. Well, the Navy prosecutor cross-examined me in a very inept way, actually bolstered my testimony, and the Navy judge ironically stated, "I think that the government has successfully proved that any service member has a reasonable cause to believe that the wars in Yugoslavia, Afghanistan, and Iraq were illegal." Ultimately, although the government had sought 9 months in jail in the brig forfeiture of pay and allowances, and a bad conduct discharge, the judge sentenced Paredes to no jail time and refused to order a bad conduct discharge. He gave Paredes 2 months restriction to the base, 3 months of hard labor without confinement, and a reduction in rank to seaman recruit.
That's very interesting history, Marjorie. And obviously you are uniquely qualified. So the 6 Democratic members of the Senate, as we have established, accurately summarize what the law is about unlawful orders. Trump responded on social media, I believe Truth Social, that they were accusing them of sedition, punishable by death. Trump says many, many things. But what's really disturbing is we've heard that the FBI opened a probe into these individuals, and that Hegseth was particularly interested in punishing Mark Kelly, who is a retired U.S. Navy officer, and therefore he was discussing the possibility of recalling him to court-martial him, or reducing his rank, or prosecuting him under military law, reducing his pension. And as we mentioned before, CNN has reported the Navy has delivered a report on what his punishment should be. The last I've checked, we don't know what the report says. I'm refreshing while listening to Marjorie. But constitutionally speaking, can these 6 members of the Senate be punished for this speech?
Absolutely not. It violates the First Amendment, and what they said was an accurate statement of the law. There is absolutely no lawful basis whatsoever for Mark Kelly to be court-martialed, or any of these lawmakers to be punished for exercising their First Amendment freedom of speech and stating what the true state of the law is.
It's interesting because, we do a lot with the Espionage Act at Defending Rights and Dissent. And one of the early purposes of the Espionage Act was to imprison people for criticizing U.S. participation in World War I. And the way they would do that, mostly there are other ways, but was that they would say, okay, this law makes it a crime to incite insubordination in the military. And I don't think anyone has ever questioned the constitutionality of that. I mean, they have. And by saying that the war is wrong, that wars are fought by the rich, or wars are started by the rich and fought by the poor, or that Woodrow Wilson is a Wall Street tool, a real example of an Espionage Act case, you were causing insubordination in the military. And a lot of what the arguments against these individuals is that they're somehow causing unrest in the military. And this seems like a very closed issue from the standpoint of the First Amendment. While people were arrested under the Espionage Act during World War I, and those convictions were shamefully ratified by the Supreme Court, it spawned the modern civil liberties movement, which created our modern understanding of the First Amendment that sort of did away with those precedents. You could no longer put someone in jail for political speech unless they intended specifically for a crime to occur. So it does seem like quite a First Amendment issue, what they're doing, and we will see what this Navy report says. None of the 6 Democrats in the video specified what they thought were the unlawful orders, and it's very unclear they could even agree to that amongst themselves. But one order that is getting a lot of attention is an order by Hegseth given to kill everyone on board a boat that was suspected of smuggling drugs. Of course, the Trump administration has offered no evidence of this. It's been described as a kill them all order, or a double tap strike, where first they attacked the boat and killed people, and then they killed the survivors. Assuming this account is accurate, what is the legality of the actions of ordering this strike? Would this be an unlawful order?
Yes. Well, the entire operation is illegal. Although Hegseth has waffled about who actually gave the order, whether it was him or whether it was Admiral Bradley who issued the order for the second strike, Trump, on September 2nd, which was the date of this attack, wrote on Truth Social, and nobody's talking about this, Chip. He said, I gave the order. I personally gave the order that resulted in the killing of 11 people. It directly came from him, the commander-in-chief. Since that double tap, and I'll come back to the double tap bombing, but since that double tap bombing, 22 publicly known U.S. airstrikes have killed at least 87 people. The legal rationale for these bombings has shifted over time, but apparently it's based on a classified memo from the Department of Justice's Office of Legal Counsel, which reportedly claims that the United States is in a state of armed conflict with drug cartels that use drug proceeds to buy weapons and fund violence, so the U.S. is acting in collective self-defense. However, there's no evidence that, assuming that there is even drugs on these boats, and they've given no evidence of that at all, but assuming that whatever group say that this group was committing an armed attack against the U.S., that would not allow the U.S. to use military force in national self-defense, because international law does not allow governments to simply murder alleged drug traffickers. These constitute extrajudicial executions. They should have, if there was probable cause to believe that crimes were being committed, they should have arrested them, brought them to trial with due process protections under the Constitution. And by the way, an assessment came from the U.S. intelligence agencies on February 26th and found that Tren de Aragua, which is the group that Trump cited in his post, that Tren de Aragua was neither controlled by the Venezuelan government nor committing crimes in the U.S. on its orders. Now, let's assume there was a state of armed conflict. These would be war crimes. The Geneva Conventions forbid the targeting of civilians, and the Geneva Conventions also forbid the targeting of shipwrecked sailors, which is what these two survivors from this first strike on September 2nd constituted. And so it was highly illegal in the first place to be targeting civilians. And secondly, even if there was a state of war, these were shipwrecked sailors, and under the Geneva Conventions, the laws of war binding the United States, because the United States has ratified the Geneva Conventions, making them part of U.S. law under the Supremacy Clause of the Constitution, would have been illegal. Without a state of armed conflict, it's just plain murder.
I want to talk about shipwrecked soldiers for a second, because as many people have pointed out, the Department of Defense is, I guess it's Department of War now, the Department of War's Law of War Manual from 2023 has a section called Clearly Illegal Orders to Commit Law of War Violations. And it reads, let me read it to you. The requirement to refuse to comply with orders to commit law of war violations applies to orders to perform conduct that is clearly illegal or orders that the subordinate knows in fact are illegal. For example, orders to fire upon the shipwrecked would be clearly illegal. So this is the example of an unlawful or illegal order the Department of Defense's Law of War Manual gives. And Hegseth or whoever else, Trump, has authorized that. I want to go to a more wonky question for a minute. A lot of people have called what happened a war crime, and some of the human rights groups have been uncomfortable with this. Obviously, war crime is very visceral. It evokes My Lai, Abu Ghraib, but they're making the point that you made earlier, that there is not an international armed conflict, and therefore the laws of war does not apply. And that as horrific as this is, it isn't a war crime. It's just old-fashioned murder. Do you think that the laws of war are the lens we should be looking through this for? Is there a state of armed conflict here?
There is no state of armed conflict, but even if there was, they would still be illegal because they were targeting civilians, and certainly with this double tap, they were targeting shipwrecked sailors, which, as you said, violates not just the Geneva Conventions, but also the Law of War Manual, the U.S. own Law of War Manual. There is just no scenario whatsoever on this earth that would support the legality of these strikes.
So you have edited a book about the legality of both targeted killings and drone strikes. I believe it came out during the Obama years. One of the pushbacks we're hearing from supporters of President Trump is that, well, Obama did drone strikes, Obama did targeted killings. For example, Roger Stone, I'm sure we're all a fan of Roger Stone, Trump advisor, asked on social media, was it a war crime when Obama killed thousands with drones? I'm going to pose Mr. Stone's question to you, Marjorie. Was it a war crime when Obama killed thousands with drones?
If it was a war, and George W. Bush basically initiated a so-called war on terror after he illegally invaded Iraq and Afghanistan and changed their regimes, also illegally, and Obama continued this so-called war on terror. If you assume that it was a war, and Obama defined the battlefield as pretty much the whole world, then these were war crimes because they were firing on civilians. You cannot target civilians under the Geneva Conventions, even under a state of war. Obama had a policy that all military-aged men who were killed in what he defined as a drone strike zone were considered to be combatants unless there is explicit intelligence posthumously proving them innocent. He engaged in what are called signature strikes, sometimes called crowd killings, that targeted training camps and, quote, suspicious compounds in areas controlled by militants, unquote. And the Obama administration admitted that a lot of the time they didn't even know who they were killing. Before taking a life off the battlefield, the Due Process Clause requires that you arrest a suspect, inform him of the charges against him or her, and bring them to trial, a fair trial with due process. Targeted or political assassinations are known as extrajudicial executions. In other words, outside the judicial process. They violate international law. Willful killings are a grave breach of the Geneva Conventions and punishable as a war crime under the U.S. War Crimes Act. Civilians must never be the target of a military strike, and a targeted killing is only lawful if it is deemed necessary to protect life, and no other means, including capture or non-lethal incapacitation, is available to protect life. And another treaty the U.S. has ratified, making it part of the U.S. law under the Constitution, under the Supremacy Clause of the Constitution, is the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which protects the right to life and prohibits arbitrary killings. So regardless of whether you think there was a state of war or not under Obama, those drone strikes were illegal.
So you've answered Roger Stone's question for him. So there were many people during the Obama years, yourself, myself, Defending Rights Dissent, the National Lawyers Guild, Center for Constitutional Rights, who were raising questions about the legality of Obama's assassination program. I think the drone program can be adequately described as a assassination program. There were also a number of people who would have been critical if a Bush or now a Trump had done the same policy, who either defended Obama or tried to push those criticisms to the side. Do you think those individuals and that attitude of ignoring the illegality and the criminality of the Obama drone strikes, the Obama assassinations, the Obama extrajudicial executions, do you think that helped to pave the road that we're to the situation we're in now, where we have Stephen Miller, carrying out extrajudicial executions of probably fishing boats in the Caribbean?
Yes, I do. I think both George W. Bush's so-called war on terror and Obama's policy of drone strikes, drone killings, assassinations, both paved the way for what the Trump administration is doing now, both illegal, highly illegal, and inexcusable.
I promised I wouldn't keep you for more than a half hour, so I'm going to give you the last question. Finally, the last night, the U.S. seized a Venezuelan oil tanker. There's a lot of sort of lack of clarity about exactly what happened, whether this tanker was in international waters or Venezuelan territorial waters. It's not clear. The U.S. has made claims it was either an unflagged vessel or was a vessel flying an improper flag, which would have impacted the legal analysis of what happened. But they boarded this vessel in order to seize oil in compliance with U.S. sanctions, what the United Nations Human Rights Council would call unilateral coercive measures against Venezuela. Acknowledging there's a lot that we don't know about what flag the vessel was flying and where it was seized, what is the legality of last night's move, both in terms of international law as well as in terms of the fact that only Congress can declare war, not the president?
Yes, this was an act of piracy, pure and simple. You know, the excuse of, well, this ship was under sanctions and so they had to board it because they were enforcing the sanctions. Unilateral coercive measures violate the UN Charter. The UN Charter is very clear.
That's a term that's growing in our circles, but I think many people watching this maybe have never heard the term unilateral coercive measures. Could you define what it is for people?
Yes. Only the Security Council under the UN Charter has the authority to impose sanctions, forceful, non-forceful measures. And so when a country like the US imposes sanctions without the blessing of the Security Council, that is considered to be a unilateral coercive measure. Unilateral meaning that one country is taking upon itself to declare these sanctions illegal. Only the Security Council is allowed to do that. So the sanctions were illegal in the first place, and they date back to 2022, when this particular ship was allegedly helping to transport Iranian oil for Hezbollah, and that's when the U.S. declared unilateral coercive sanctions against this particular ship. So the sanctions excuse is an illegal one, and there are many countries under U.S. sanctions, for example, unilateral coercive measures, all illegal. Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and the list goes on and on and on. So this was an act of international piracy, and not only that, theft. Donald Trump said, "We're going to keep the oil." So this was bald-faced a threat and provocation. It was an act of war. It was provocation. And as you said, only Congress has the right to declare war under the Constitution. Now, there is the War Powers Resolution that says that within 60 days of ordering U.S. troops into hostilities, that the president has to inform Congress. The War Powers Resolution does not override the UN Charter. The UN Charter, and we don't even have a War Powers Resolution because Congress can't agree. But the UN Charter is very clear that the only time that a country can use military force against another country is in self-defense after an armed attack. There was no armed attack by Venezuela against the U.S. or against any UN country. And so there was no lawful right of self-defense. And the other exception to this prohibition on the use of military force under the UN Charter is when the Security Council has authorized it. That hasn't happened here either. So any way you look at it, Chip, this was illegal.
So just to clarify, Trump has committed an act of war against Venezuela in violation of international law without congressional authorization. That is what we're saying, correct?
I think so. I think it is.
So too. So if you find that concerning, we're going to put a link up on the screen for you to contact your member of Congress in the House and ask them to support a bipartisan War Powers Resolution sponsored by McGovern of Massachusetts, a progressive, and Thomas Massie of Kentucky, a libertarian Republican, that will, if passed, stop Trump from taking these actions. War Powers resolutions are unique. They are privileged resolutions, which means there has to be a vote on them under the rules of the House. It's not like all this good surveillance or Espionage Act reform legislation we do, where it goes and sits in a committee and the leadership of the House sort of blocks it. This has to come to a vote. And this War Powers Resolution not only has progressive Democrats on it, like Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, Ro Khanna, McGovern, the sponsor, obviously. It also has Republicans like Marjorie Taylor Greene. This is one of those rare issues where the Marjorie Taylor Greenes and the America First MAGA types agree with the progressive Democrats like Tlaib and Omar. So there is actually a chance that this could pass. In the Senate, a similar resolution came up, and every member of the Democratic caucus voted for it. The one banning blocking war with Venezuela. There was an earlier one about the killings that Fetterman broke ranks with. But assuming this plays in the House, and there are some South Florida Democrats who maybe won't vote for this, but assuming we follow suit there, if we can get enough Republicans, we can pass this, we can stop this war. And we already have Marjorie Taylor Greene and 2 other Republicans, Thomas Massie, joining this resolution. So I would really encourage you to follow that link on your screen, to take the time to write to your members of Congress and say, we don't want this war, stop it now. And it was imperative to do this when it was introduced, and it was even more imperative to do this now that Trump, as the law professor emerita has told us, committed an act of war in international waters against Venezuela. We are on the cusp of war with a sovereign nation, and we can stop it. Marjorie Cohn, it was a pleasure to talk to you. It is always so good to have you on. Everyone, Marjorie Cohn is professor emerita at the Thomas Jefferson School of Law, a former president of the National Lawyers Guild. What was your most recent article in Truth Out?
It was about Duterte, the former president of the Philippines, who is now sitting in prison at the International Criminal Court for murder, for a crime against humanity of murder, for his war on drugs, very similar to Donald Trump, who should also be charged with a crime against humanity under the well-established doctrine of universal jurisdiction by any country around the world.
And I think we'll have to have you come back sometime to talk about the sanctions against the ICC. I'm Chip Gibbons. I'm Policy Director, Defending Rights and Dissent, where we defend your right to know and freedom to act through grassroots mobilization, public education, policy expertise, and advocacy journalism. If you like seeing programs like this, if you like hearing voices like mine and Marjorie, please go to rightsanddissent.org/donate and donate today. Thank you, everyone. And until next time, have a good day.